We hear about it all the time, right? Economic inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor, it's constantly in the news. But have you ever stopped to wonder, how do we actually measure that? I mean, how do you take this huge, complicated social problem and, boil it down to just one number that we can all understand and compare?
Yeah, it sounds simple enough, but trust me, finding a clear, objective way to measure that economic gap, well, that's one of the biggest puzzles for economists and policymakers out there.
So, to tackle this, they've come up with two key tools that work together. First, there's a special kind of graph that helps us see the problem. And second, there's a single number that lets us measure it.
All right, first up is the graph. It's called the Lorenz Curve, and its whole job is to take this fuzzy idea of inequality and make it something you can literally see with your own eyes.
Okay, so what exactly are we looking at here? Just imagine this. You line up every single person in a country, from the one with the lowest income all the way to the one with the highest. That's your line across the bottom, the horizontal axis. Now the vertical axis, that tracks the total share of income. So as you move along that line of people, you're basically asking, okay, what slice of the country's total economic pie do all these folks have combined?
Now, this graph is all about comparing the ideal world to the real world. See that straight diagonal green line? That's our line of perfect equality. It's a world where the bottom 20% of people have 20% of the money, the bottom 50% have 50%, and so on. A perfect one-to-one match. But then you see those curved blue lines. That's reality. That's what the actual, often messy distribution of income looks like in most places.
And here's the key takeaway, the thing you can see in a split second. The further that blue curve, the reality curve, bends away from that straight green line, the more inequality there is. It's like a visual gut check for a whole country's economy.
But, a picture is great, but it isn't always enough, right? If you want to compare different countries or see if things are getting better or worse over time, you need to turn that visual gap into an actual number. And that is where the Gini Index comes into play.
So the most important thing to get here is that the Gini Index isn't just some random number they made up. No, it comes directly from that Lorenz curve we were just looking at. Really, it's just a clever way of measuring the size of that gap between the perfect world and the real world. So if we look at our graph one more time, the Gini Index is literally a measurement of that space, that area between the green line of equality and the blue curve of reality. It takes the size of that gap and spits out a single, simple number. The bigger that area gets, the higher the Gini score, and the more inequality you have. Simple as that.
Let's talk about the scale. A Gini Index of 0. That means perfect equality. The blue reality curve would lie right on top of the green line. Everybody would earn the exact same amount. It's a theoretical ideal, right?
And then you have the other extreme, a Gini of 1. That's total, absolute inequality. A world where one single person has all the money and everybody else has 0. Nothing. Okay, so, theory's down. We've got a curve to help us see it and a number to help us measure it. But what does any of this actually look like out there, in the real world?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. On one end of the spectrum, you've got places like the Scandinavian countries. With policies like progressive taxes and strong social safety nets, they end up with really low Gini scores, something around 0.25. That tells you income is spread out pretty evenly. But then you look at a country like Brazil, which has historically had scores way up over 0.50. That points to a much, much wider gap. See? Just those two numbers tell a powerful story about two totally different economic systems. But here's the really powerful part. These numbers aren't set in stone. They can change. And Brazil is a perfect example of this. They introduced these targeted social programs, like Bolsa Familia, which gave cash directly to poorer families. And what happened? They actually made a real, measurable dent in their inequality, bringing that high Gini score down. It's just a fantastic example of how policy can move the needle on this stuff.
Okay, so the Gini Index is obviously super useful, but it's not the whole story. And this is really important. Like any single number trying to sum up an entire complex society, it definitely has some pretty big blind spots.
So for example, the Gemini can sometimes gloss over what's happening to the middle class because it pays more attention to the very rich and the very poor. It tells us that there's inequality, but it doesn't tell us why. Is it because of wage gaps, or is it about inherited wealth? And maybe the biggest blind spot of all, it only looks at income. It completely ignores other huge factors like, whether people have good health care or can get a decent education, things that are absolutely fundamental to living a good life.
This brings up a fascinating, kind of mind-bending question. Do you think it's possible for two completely different societies to have the exact same Gini score? Well, the answer is yes, it's totally possible. Think about it.
picture one country where a tiny group of people at the top has almost all the money, and everyone else is equally poor. Okay? Now picture a different country where there are no super rich people, but there's a huge gap between a struggling lower class and a pretty comfortable middle class. Believe it or not, those two very different places could have the exact same Gini score. It just goes to show you the Gini is a powerful summary for sure, but man, it does not tell the whole story.
So, if the Gini score has these limitations, what's the solution? Well, we don't throw it out. We just add more tools to the toolbox to get a fuller picture.
And that's exactly why economists don't just rely on one thing. They have a whole toolkit. They might use something called the Palmer ratio, which hones in on the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 40%. Or they'll use these multi-dimensional poverty indices that bring in those other factors we talked about, like health and education. Think of it like a car's dashboard. The Gini is just one gauge, maybe the speedometer. You need to look at the fuel gauge and the engine temperature too, to really know what's going on.
And that, right there, is really the bottom line. A problem as big and messy as inequality just can't be squeezed into a single perfect number. To really understand it, and more importantly, to do something about it, you've got to look at it from all sorts of different angles.
So that leaves us with one last big question to think about. If we know that one number is never going to be enough, what's the right mix? What combination of data, of graphs, and maybe even personal stories do we need to truly see the whole human picture of inequality? That's the challenge ahead for all of us. Thanks so much for joining me.